What is neurodiversity?
What is it about these people?
Dyslexia.
Autism spectrum.
ADHD.
Gifted.
Dysgraphia.
All brains are different.
It's okay to be who you are.
This is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Hello to you, and welcome to episode 98. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and I'm the author of Teaching Twice Exceptional Learners in Today's Classroom, which is available now. Today, I'm excited to share with you my talk with Emily Raclaw. Emily is a professional counselor who is part of a really unique program that is working to help bright, neurodivergent students succeed in college. Before we jump into our interview, I want to take a moment to invite you to join our Facebook group. The Neurodiversity Podcast Advocacy and Support Group is a place for parents and educators, clinicians, neurodivergent people to share their questions and experiences with other neurodiversity affirming folks. If you enjoy connecting with other people who understand neurodiversity, this is a great place for you. You can also follow our social media pages in the typical places. On Instagram and Facebook, we are Neurodiversity Podcast, and on Twitter, we are at NeurodiversePod. Coming right up.
Hi, I'm Emily Raclaw. I'm the director of On Your Marq at Marquette University, and we serve students on the autism spectrum.
That is next.
Identifying, supporting, and challenging gifted and twice exceptional students is often difficult for school districts. But Emily Kircher-Morris's new book, Teaching Twice Exceptional Learners in Today's Classroom, provides guidelines and a unique approach for identifying and understanding 2E students. It includes strategies that will help educators and administrators provide strength-based instruction, motivate twice exceptional learners, and even help them with self-regulation. It contains important information to help educators advocate for 2E students, including things you need to know about individualized education plans and the Section 504 plan process. This important new book is now available. Go to neurodiversitypodcast.com for links to get your copy. Teaching Twice Exceptional Learners in Today's Classroom from Free Spirit Publishing.
You're listening to
The Neurodiversity Podcast.
Today, we're talking to Emily Raclaw about a unique program that is designed to support autistic students at the university level. So, Emily, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm so excited to be here.
So you are at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and the On Your Marq program was designed specifically to support neurodivergent learners who are autistic so that they can have some additional supports at the university level. So tell me just a little bit about the On Your Marq program. How did it begin? What are its goals? All that good stuff.
While I'm the founding director, the actually work for the program started many years ago when 3 professors sat down and said, we've been doing this research, we've been seeing the patterns of autistic individuals coming to college, and they may do okay academically, but the outcomes aren't great, where they're dropping out or not completing degrees. In some cases, even worse, the mental health toll on them is significant. So what they decided is they said, okay, let's look at the factors that are causing this. And I don't do research, I'm a practitioner. And they put a bunch of fancy numbers together over years and said, we think this is a formula that will work to counteract some of those things that are happening. So a grant was written, and they actually did not get awarded the grant, but we had a very generous donor who said, this is a great idea. I have a family member who's autistic. They would definitely benefit from this program. So that's how I got to get started. And we're in our 3rd year. We've tripled in size since our 1st year, and we plan to continue growing.
It's an interesting 3 years to be starting this whole program.
Absolutely.
So it started right around like the semester before the pandemic began?
Exactly.
Okay.
So while other programs in the country were like, oh my gosh, how do we shift? I was like, I don't even know how to normally do a spring semester. So here we go.
Interesting. Yeah. So you're a practitioner. You're a licensed professional counselor by training.
Yes.
And I feel like, though, there's often a reason why people end up in the field of counseling and specifically working with neurodivergent people. So what are the experiences that brought you specifically to this field?
Well, there's a long answer and a short answer. I'll try to give the in-between answer. The first one was When I first finished my master's program, I was like, okay, I want to work with kids who have had a really hard time in school, or no matter what that is, to try to figure out how to make classrooms more accessible, how to train teachers, train parents to give kids who are just learn differently a chance. Turns out I'm really good at working with students who are autistic. So after a while of only having like an hour a week with students, and these kids who were coming in who would have random labels that weren't autism, but now that I know better, it was autism, I was like, an hour a week just isn't enough. So I decided I wanted to actually be a teacher. So I actually went back to school to get my special education certification. It turns out I have ADHD, which explains a whole lot about why school was difficult for me, why my brain works the way it does, why people are like, how did you remember that? I'm like, I don't know. You don't remember that happening. And then mostly I think this job, what makes it most important for me is that my son is also neurodivergent. He has ADHD as well. And just looking at him having a completely different educational experience than I did makes what I do so much more worth it.
Yeah. It's interesting, your path, because it kind of mirrors mine in some ways. I started out as a teacher and then got my master's and am a licensed professional counselor. And like you mentioned, it's like we know so much more about autism now.
Yes.
You mentioned like you knew that they were struggling, but you didn't associate it necessarily with autism. But now you're like, oh, clearly that is related to this type of neurodivergence.
The biggest thing for me was the clarifying questions. And at first, as an adult, I'm like, why is this kid questioning why I'm saying this? I'm the teacher. Listen to me. This is correct. Why do you need to know this information? And so they were like, oh, well, they're just being disrespectful. So you need to have a consequence for that behavior. And now I know no, they literally need to know the information so they can follow the direction that I'm asking them to do. And my son is similar in that. And if I give him like, okay, go clean your room, he's like, well, what do you mean clean my room? And he's not talking back. He doesn't understand what I'm saying.
I agree. That is so common that communication barriers are perceived by those in authority as disrespect. At younger ages, it definitely impacts kids at the school level. And I can see how at the university level that would also impact things. What are some of the things that you see there?
So to phrase it in a story, I had a new freshman, our first year in the program, and I started around the same day the students started, so I didn't have a lot of chance to talk to professors. I got 5 emails about one student who had asked questions after every single slide the professor showed. And as most of us know, when you go to college, your first day of class is syllabus day, and the professor wants to just get through that syllabus and probably send you on the way. Not always the case, but most times the case. And I sat down and I was like, okay, so what happened? What questions was the student asking? And they're like, oh, well, they were just questioning my research methods and why I chose this. And I said, so it sounds like they were asking clarifying questions.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I was able to talk to the professors and explain it, they were like, oh, but at the same time, because we also want to set our students up for social success in the classroom, had to have a conversation with the student and say, okay, so these questions are great questions. How do we present them in a way that doesn't first drag the class out 10 minutes over the time it's supposed to be, and 2, allows other kids a chance to ask questions, and 3, and actually get to the information you're looking for.
How do the professors respond to that feedback?
Honestly, I feel like we're really lucky. I haven't had any professor just say, no, absolutely not, I'm not doing this. Some professors have been like, oh, well, I don't know what I'm doing. And I said, don't worry. 1, I have a quick little checklist for you of things to think about. And I've really worked with my students in self-advocating. And when they send their accommodation letters, if they're using them, I encourage them to disclose as they're comfortable and say, yeah, I'm autistic, and this is the way my autism impacts me and what I need from you so that we can effectively work together.
Mm-hmm.
And they CC me on the email, and I've seen some amazing, really, really wonderful responses from professors saying, thanks so much for letting me know. Let's schedule an office hours meeting so we can make sure we have everything set up.
What are some of the things that you put on the checklist for the professors?
So I try to say, like, give direct feedback. So the example I always give is, if you tell somebody this needs more depth, I don't know what that means.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, I'm neurodivergent, but I also, I can get some subtext. But if you tell a student on the spectrum, hey, you need more depth in this paragraph, I'm like, okay, that's fair feedback, but point to a place in the paper where they did that skill or did what you were looking for. Some other things I say is, with your syllabus, it's best and just special education in general, to have like the calendar of what's due when. And if you have questions, who to ask. If you have questions about, for example, someone will say, here's this big project that's due at midterm. It's helpful if they say in the syllabus, have your topic due by this day or this by this day. Just because everyone, college freshmen have no idea what they're doing in general, and it's just helpful for everybody. So it's kind of more of a universal design approach.
Yeah.
I think something else is useful if you notice that a student seems to be maybe just a little socially different, you maybe set a meeting with that student and try to figure out what's going on so you can make sure that you're communicating with them effectively as well.
This is just really great advice and ideas, not only for people who are in the education field, but parents too, because I think that sometimes that's what parents need to do. It's like we assume that kids know things because they are common sense to us, or maybe we've even seen them complete a specific skill previously.
Mm-hmm.
But if we just go forward and are really detailed about it, and I think always from a point where you're giving somebody the benefit of the doubt, that if they understand what's necessary, they're going to do those things.
Being clear is kind. And so, I mean, I live by checklists. My family, we live by checklists. And it's just really easy to say to people, here are the things you need to make sure you have everything turned in on time.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you need to follow. Follow this calendar. We're good to go. As a professor and as a teacher, or even as a parent, you know the things that need to get done in your home, in your classroom, wherever.
Mm-hmm.
Just communicate it.
So on episode 90, we spoke to Elizabeth Hamblett, and we talked to her about how to help students make the transition to university, specifically about accessing accommodations. But it does seem like On Your Marq program really goes beyond just those general accommodations and works to create a culture of inclusivity surrounding autistic students.
Yeah.
What does creating an inclusive culture surrounding neurodiversity look like to you?
So for me, we have our home base in Coughlin Hall in the middle of campus where our students come for their executive functioning coaching, their peer mentoring, sometimes tutoring. It's kind of just home base. We have our social space here. But on campus, we have individuals who have been, trained sounds weird, but who have been exposed and talked to about appropriate ways to communicate with neurodivergent individuals. So if our student goes to the tutoring center, if our student goes to the writing center or career center, they're not going to be treated like they're weird. They're not going to be treated like, oh, this kid came in and asked me these millions of questions and I didn't, it just felt really weird. I don't know. That's not going to happen here. Aside from the academic side, even the housing side, all of our RAs and hall directors have also been exposed to training, and they have access to a whole online video thing of experiencing kind of life as an autistic person that have been put together by autistic individuals, so that they can kind of have that feedback as well.
So it's a very holistic approach. You've got the housing people involved, you've got the professors involved, and then it sounds like you've got these additional supports like the coaching, and it sounds like there's executive functioning coaching, but then maybe also academic component to it.
Well, we also have the mental health component. So it's all kind of mixed together. I tell our families, because, parents want to know who's going to be involved in my kid. I say they get at least 3 people. They get a graduate coach who does a lot of the executive functioning and academic coaching. They have someone who they can talk to about mental health stuff. We joke and call it happies and crappies. The students say, let's just call it mental health support. I'm like, okay, we don't need to use my funny name. And then they get a peer mentor who helps with the social navigation. I'm too old to understand how to make friends effectively. I'm also too old to understand how to do laundry on campus or make the printers work. So our peer mentors really help with that social navigation. And I guess it's 4 people. Then they get me, and I'm either school mom, cool aunt, the lawyer, or the principal's office, depending on what we need at that time.
It is more than just getting accommodations.
Right.
And we want them to be successful because it's not an ability issue.
It's absolutely not. It's how your brain works. I'm looking right now at in my office. I have 2 giant sticky notes with sticky notes on it in my organization system, which I guess isn't that organized, but for my brain, it works. But a lot of these students coming from the K-12 system, their way of studying, their way of organizing, all those things don't translate as well to the higher education system. When you're expected to not only manage academics, you have to manage your free time and your personal life and your personal cares. And how do I do all that and still stay on top of things without mom or dad reminding me to do things?
twice exceptional students, in case anyone in our audience doesn't know, those are students who are both cognitively gifted and have another diagnosis, so ADHD, dyslexia, autism, whatever. What do you notice about how being twice exceptional influences a student's struggles or successes in higher ed?
Students are surprised by the gaps in knowledge they might have. They may have come and been really smart. Well, they are really smart, but they knew everything before the professor said or the teacher said it. They knew what was going to happen in class. They were able to master the subjects independently. And now when they're coming to higher ed, the professor is not asking you to just spit the stuff back to me. They want you to apply it. And some of our students struggle with taking it to the next level because it's more abstract, right? It's not like an exact thing they're asking for. They say, okay, now we understand. Okay, I don't understand science, so I'm not going to use that as an example. But they'll say, now there's a rhetorical analysis paper on this book you read. What does that mean? Tell me, like, I can tell you what happened in the book. I can tell you what I think about the characters, but then what does rhetorical analysis really mean?
Do many of them come in having, like, realizing that they are twice exceptional if they have that label? Do they even know what that is?
I don't think they do. I mean, there's kids who are applying to the honors college like, oh yeah, I know I'm smart, but they don't make the connection that means they're twice exceptional, which is actually kind of fascinating to me. I mean, most of my students are self-aware to an extent, but to not put the two together is kind of like, I guess it's fascinating to me. Like, yeah, you're double cool.
You mentioned that you have a son who's ADHD, and I have 3 kids, and 2 of them are also diagnosed as ADHDers. And last night we went to the night at the middle school to, like, introduce, get to know the teachers. I don't even know what they call it anymore because it was, like, not really officially.
Meet the teacher night?
Yes. And my son, who's 13, was with me in it. And so I was introducing myself to the teachers who I hadn't met yet because he's my oldest. And I wanted to let them know and kind of make sure, like, okay, so he has a 504 in place. Here are some things if you can kind of help me help him, but also building his independence. And he was super embarrassed. And so I felt really bad because I think that's probably the first time we've really had that conversation. Like, we've talked to him about it and I've talked to the teachers about it, but I think it's maybe even the first time we've had that conversation all in the same space. And when we left, I was talking to him and I could tell he just was like, didn't like that attention, on him. How do you see that playing out with students? Just that I guess maybe, I don't know if it's anxiety or just a little bit of maybe even shame. What do you see?
So my resistant kiddos at first will be like, well, that was high school. This is college. Let me try it on my own. And I'm going to do great. I'm going to do everything. I'm going to set my alarms. I'm going to work the system. And usually about 3 weeks in, their system comes crashing down. Not because they aren't capable, but again, because the system is flawed and based on past knowledge of what worked in K-12, not understanding the requirements of the higher ed stuff. I think it comes from feeling like I was the smartest kid in class and I knew what to do. There's no way that I can't do this in college the same way, not realizing that colleges are selective and a lot of people in your class we're also maybe the smartest kid in class. We're also gifted, may also be twice exceptional. And all of you are now in one classroom and that changes the dynamic.
It's that big fish, little pond effect. And it's a hard transition.
Yeah. And so I found for students in terms of, like, feeling embarrassed, we talk about ways, how can you communicate your needs in a way that makes you feel more comfortable? Thanks to technology and maybe also the pandemic, using email has worked really well. Having a one-on-one meeting when there's not, like, other people in class for the professor. You don't have to wait to go up to class after with the professor. You can make appointments in office hours. You can send an email. You can do a video conference. It feels like many of my students haven't had the chance to advocate for themselves or explain their needs on their own in their own terms. And when now they're expected to do it as adults because, disability services says, nope, mom's not coming, you're 18, you're good. The school says without releases, we can't do these things. Policy says if you want your accommodations, you need to deliver them to the professor. And this whole time along the way, we haven't really been super inclusive of the students in the process. So they don't know what to do. And so I think fear, shame, but also maybe feeling like, well, I don't know what to do. Someone else already did this for me, so I just won't do it.
Parents who might be listening to this episode are probably trying to figure out what they can do right now to help get their child ready for that transition to college. And so what do you think are the most important things that a parent can do? Like, what are some action steps that they could take?
Let your kid take the lead in their 504 meeting, or if they have an IEP, in their IEP meeting. They know what they need. I don't care if you're 16, 17, even 14, they should start being able to say in class, this has worked for me, or this hasn't worked for me. Because on paper, as parents, we're not at school all day. We think, okay, yes, this all sounds brilliant, but it may not be what your student needs. I think it's also really important if your student has higher support needs, but they are also capable for your work, to start pulling back some of those supports that sophomore, junior year, so that when they come to college, it's not as rough of a transition. If you had a student who maybe had a one-on-one aide to kind of do those social cueing, you're not going to get that at university. Or most universities, I shouldn't say this is like a hard, fast rule, but if students are getting maybe double time on an exam, the university may say, well, usually time and a half is what we're saying, double time on occasion, depending on the disability or depending on documentation. But is that student actually using the full double time, or is time and a half more appropriate? Looking at those accommodations and really thinking, is this what my kid needs, or is this what I think we need as a safety net?
How do you, at the university level, how do you monitor those things? How often are those accommodations revisited?
Students are able to revisit them at any time. So for me in my program, I talk to my students and I say, okay, you got your accommodation letter, you had your accommodation meeting. Let's try the first, go to class, utilize whatever you think you need to utilize, and let's talk about how that's working for you. At any point in time at my university, students can go to the Office of Disability Services and say, hey, I needed this additional accommodation. And if they have the documentation for it, it can be considered. Or they can say to them, hey, okay, I hear you. We don't have documentation to support that right now. What can we do to help get documentation for that? Or what else do we currently have documentation for that can help meet that need?
I know that it varies from university to university. So what type of documentation does your university look for as far as putting those accommodations in place?
So most of my students, and so I work in a separate office, I don't know 100%, but I can speak for my students. Most of my students submit their last IEP. Some submit a neuropsych eval if they have one that's more recent, not from when they were 5, although they can submit that if they want to. Some people just use the letters from their mental health providers. What do they need and why do they need it? Or this is their disability, this is how it impacts them in the classroom, and this is the accommodations because it makes sense for that.
You mentioned earlier something about self-advocacy, which I think is just such an important skill. How do you work with the students that you support in building that self-advocacy skill? Is there something specific or?
So each of my kids, call them kids, I know they're adults, but they're all a little different. And so we kind of take a different approach based on the students. So I have one student who really likes to just talk things through with somebody else and say, okay, I know I need to tell the professor this, but I don't know what I'm going to do if they say no and they say this. We'll make decision trees, right? And say, okay, so if the professor says this, then what will we say? Or if they say this, then what will we say? So to help kind of walk through the different scenarios that they're coming up with in their brains, or the anxieties that they're coming up across, that's been really helpful for some of my students, other than to just have a script ready so they know what they're going to say, and it may be one they can reuse all the time. And having our students develop it themselves, because I always tell them, I say, I can say what I think, but I'm not you, and I don't have to interact with these people every day. So how much you want to share, how much you don't feel like sharing, that's completely up to you. We had a student who was he got assigned to a group, all group work, and it was during the pandemic. So if you can imagine, it was a class that was hybrid, so it was virtual, but also in person, then it was also a group work. And there were some issues with the first assignment because my student did his part, but did nothing else. And it was kind of this assumed idea that, oh, once you get done with this, you're supposed to also do this. So he got a report saying that his group was mad at him, and he was like, oh my gosh, what happened? I don't know. And I said, well, did you disclose to them before the project started, like we kind of talked about? He said, no, I decided not to. And I said, okay, that's your right. What do you think your next step should be? And then putting it on the student was kind of like, okay, I should say something. And I said, yeah, okay, what does something look like? So I think just giving that freedom and giving that permission to own themselves, own their identity, and own how they want to share it has been, I think, great.
Yeah, it's really empowering for them. Okay, I know we're about out of time, so here's my last question for you as we wrap up. If you were talking to a neurodivergent student who's trying to manage just all of the anxiety that comes along with that transition to new school, new living arrangements, new social relationships. What would you say to help them ease their worries?
It's really scary and everybody's scared, but it's going to be okay in a little bit. Utilize your resources, find your circle of people, but also make sure you're taking time for yourself to be your authentic self, and don't overmask.
Emily, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. I enjoyed being here.
There are a million ways to create both environmental and programming changes to support the unique needs of neurodivergent individuals. In the past, not having these options available has been a barrier to success, not only in the short term, but also in the ability for neurodivergent people to achieve their long-term goals. A little creativity, a lot of communication, and an investment of time by the people who are involved in neurodiverse settings can make a huge difference for neurodivergent people. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Emily Raclaw runs Marquette's On the Marq program, and to learn more about On the Marq, check out our episode page at neurodiversitypodcast.com for some links of interest. A reminder, October is ADHD Awareness Month. Watch for a special series of episodes from us in the next 2 weeks. The Neurodiversity Podcast is hosted by Emily Kircher-Morris and produced and edited by me, Dave Morris. Until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, and thanks for listening. This podcast is a production of Morris Creative Services.